movement against incarceration. Finally, the question of the federal government and repression. I don't have time to talk about this. Maybe we can talk about it in the question-answer period, but there's been a recent controversy. A new book was published by a journalist, Seth Rosenfeld, called Subversives, about the FBI's war on radicals in Berkeley. And he's claimed that one of the important kind of founding members of the party was working as an FBI informant. And this has raised a debate among historians, journalists, and activists about how much do we know about the real role of state surveillance and repression. By its nature, finding sources on state surveillance is very difficult, but I'd say the next generation of Black Power studies needs to think about the role of law enforcement, state, local, and federal. And this debate about Richard Aoki and the Black Panther Party really opens up a chance for us to think as scholars and as activists, how do we reckon with that role of state repression? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I was going to tell Hasan the last time I heard somebody speak like that, I wound up at the bottom of a baptismal pool, so. I want to offer some reflections this afternoon with you. My colleagues have covered most of the terrain. I think that's appropriate to our discussion of the state of the field. And so I just want to offer a few reflections, and I say anytime you put the Supremes up on the big screen, you go for it. But it's interesting to have this conference in Charleston, primarily because last evening we had an opportunity to visit the old slave mart. And being in a city that has been so central to the identity of slavery in this country, and then to be here in 2012 and to be able to talk about Black Power is particularly important. Today also marks the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And again, that anniversary, along with yesterday's anniversary, one-year anniversary of the execution of Troy Davis, speaks to the importance of this conference, its location, and its message. Talking about the Black Panther Party, Donna's already done a phenomenal job of this. I'll just say that primarily for me, one of the problems as a Panther scholar, as a scholar of the Black Power movement, is dealing with the dichotomy of the programs, the liberation schools, the community political education programs, the Breakfast for Children program, and the violence. And trapped in between the two, somewhere in the middle, is the truth of what these organizations, what this movement meant. And part of what I want to talk to you about today is how we come to that truth. I had hoped that Brother Cleveland Sellers was here because as much as I love the title of this conference taken from James Baldwin, I do have a slight problem with the fire next time. I think that it's more appropriate that we talk about movements in terms of rivers. And I go back to Vincent Gordon Harding's work, There Is a River, because primarily when you're standing outside the old slave mart and you think about the transportation of human beings to America, to the Americas for the purpose of labor, and then them progressing through various stages of freedom, as my brother Hasan Jeffries talked about, to liberation, that the river is actually more powerful than the fire. In fact, it's interesting that with Cleveland Sellers' book, he titled it The River of No Return, and yet they have a flame crackling through the middle of the book. Fires consume, but even a river that dries up with a good hard rain can bear life. And in a lot of ways, I want to talk about the ways in which this river analogy work in terms of talking about the Black Power movement. And I want to do that by talking very briefly about a jazz musician by the name of Gary Bartz. Gary Bartz was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1940, and he arrived in New York in 1958, a wide-eyed 17-year-old migrant to the city, and began to study at Juilliard Conservatory, but at the same time pursued his interest in jazz among some of the great jazz masters of the day. And Most people know him because in the 1970s, or by the 1970s, he had produced 3 critically acclaimed albums. And one of those albums had a track on it, which was based on a song that he had written called I Speak of Rivers. And I want to share that with you because I think it, or a piece of it at least, it summarizes very neatly what my colleagues, Dr. Murch and Dr. Jeffries, were talking about. This is what Gary Bartz wrote. All through Africa and North America, in South America and in Australia, I've known rivers. I've known rivers. I've known rivers in the north and the south. I've known rivers in the east and the west. I've known rivers all over this world. I've sailed some and seen the rest. I've known rivers. I've known rivers. I've known rivers, ancient dusky rivers, and my soul has grown deep like the rivers I've seen and the rivers I've known, the ancient world older than the blood. The power in dealing with the scholarship associated with the Black Power movement stems from, as Donna Murch talked about, this generational change. In fact, Abraham Eisenstadt and John Hope Franklin write in the opening of every edition of the American History series, each generation writes its own history, for it tends to see the past in the foreshortened perspective of its own experience. We live in a contemporary historical moment in which many of the freedom politics, the issues that defined the 1960s and 1970s are still with us. And they impact us in profound ways. We take the politicization of the movement symbolized last year by this gentleman, Glenn Beck, who talked about reclaiming the civil rights movement. I was highly entertained by this. Mr. Beck said, this is a moment that we reclaim the civil rights movement. It's been so distorted and turned upside down, it's an abomination. I wondered what movement he was talking about. Certainly could be the same movement that we've been writing about, and I think a function of that is what Hasan talked about when he hinted at the problem of historical amnesia. What Donna talked about when she hinted at the problem of historical amnesia in the way that we think about the civil rights and Black Power movements. We began with Jimmy Baldwin. I offer another quote from Jimmy Baldwin. The world changes according to the way people see it, and if you alter even by a millimeter the way people look at reality, then you can change it. I would submit to you that Black Power scholarship has been involved with changing the way that people look at reality. Think about our contemporary historical moment. And from that standpoint, I will skip all the things that my colleagues have already covered in terms of the long civil rights and Black Power struggles, but I will share with you that part of what we've been trying to do is disentangle a discussion of Black Power from the binaries of the 1960s, the good and bad that Professor Murch talked about. And in so doing, get people to think about the ways in which Black Power looked north and south, east and west, how it looked internationally. As Peniel Joseph talked about, the local, national, and international contours of this struggle. It also forces us, as Professor Jeffries talked about, to think about the longue durée in terms of the Black Power movement. This is a political cartoon from 1919, and last time I checked, that says Black Power. So the whole notion that the Black Power movement emerged in 1966 with the Black Panthers or with Stokely Carmichael's call, problematic, if for nothing else, because we see it here and see it expressed very forcefully in what Professor Jeffries talked about, economic justice and economic rights. I'm going to skip a couple of these, talk about some of the scholarship, and what I want to do is begin with Cleveland Sellers, because Cleveland Sellers was also a migrant. He grew up in South Carolina, but he winds up at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And while at Howard, he joins a group called NAG. Why they call it NAG? Because they want to nag the conscience of the city of Washington to extend civil rights to African Americans. But it's something that he writes in his autobiography that I think is pretty powerful. He says, although we sponsored dances and benefits for SNP, that was not our primary task. Our primary task was demonstrating. Whenever Black people in the city of Washington needed pickets, that's when they would get in touch with NAG. It didn't matter to us if it was cold outside. If we thought it could help Black people, we didn't mind demonstrating. And that's important because part of what Peniel Joseph talks about when we talk about civil rights and Black Power is the fact that Black Power exists alongside civil rights, but is the movement with no name. And we recognize it sometimes by its fingerprints, by its elements, and you see that here. For the Black Power movement, it was never about a Black man sitting at the front of the bus. I love this political cartoon because it neatly encapsulates all of the myths that Donna Murch talked about and the notion that if we take Brown versus Board of Education and we lump it together with school desegregation, then the ultimate goal of that movement was to put a black man in the White House. Well, we put a black man in the mayor's office in Atlanta, we put a black mayor in the mayor's office in Chicago, we put a black man, a chief of police in Philadelphia. How'd that work out for us? So the argument that the culmination of this would be this political process is problematic in and of itself. I was going to talk a little bit about my book, but I don't have much time. What I want to share with you is this. I love you, Rob. I mean, it's definitely. History is not just about roots, it's about routes. And when Donna talked about Black Power as a migration story, I wanted to focus on the title of the book, which comes from Stevie Wonder's album, Living for the City. Now, I would sing it for you, but let's just leave it at that. If we think about the lyrics to this song, what it is a blueprint for the freedom politics that Hasan Jeffries talked about very well. We're in a room surrounded by, oh, it is playing. But it's not playing anymore. If we think about the lyrics for that song, a boy is born where? Surrounded by four walls that ain't so pretty, his parents give him love and affection, so he's born into poverty. I would suggest to you that what Stevie Wonder is doing here is reflecting the historical moment in which he lived, talking about economic inequality. His father what? Works, sometimes for 14 hours. So his father finds himself in the grips of unfair labor practices, right? His mother is a domestic. His sister walks to school. Literally what Stevie Wonder is, if you were here yesterday and I talked about Frederick Douglass in 1865, Stevie Wonder and Frederick Douglass are in conversation about the issues in 1865 that have not been transformed by 1973 when this song is released. That's pretty powerful, and that's what Black Power organizers are organizing around. In Donna's book, Living for the City, and Hasan's book, Bloody Lounge, what we get is a glimpse of some of these activists. These aren't the people that we're accustomed to knowing on a first-name basis. This is not your Martin Luther Kings and your Kwame Toure's. It's people like this woman. You know down south, you lived on a plantation, you worked it, you had your food, clothing, and shelter. Up here, they lived on a plantation with Boss Daly as a slave master. Their jobs, their clothes, their shelter, their food, all depended on Boss Daly. And everything was connected. Any little thing you did, you had to pay for it. You know, okay, Mrs. Jones, I'll move your garbage now, but now you go down and vote for so-and-so. In my own work on New Haven, a Black Panther by the name of George Edwards talking about the Constitution State. I thought this was a place out of somebody's fantasy. I couldn't believe that Connecticut, the Constitution State, the home of so-called constitutional democracy, integration, and better race relations, and all the hype and propaganda they have bombarded us with. I thought, where the hell am I at? I thought this is the other side of the plantation, that's all I thought. And if I come from the southern side of the plantation, and this is the other side of the plantation, it's gotta be better, but this was even worse. And it culminates in a passage from our good friend Matthew Countryman's book, Up South, about Philadelphia, where he's talking about a gentleman, Vernon Moore, who says, I was determined when I got back from World War II combat that what rights I didn't have, I was gonna take, using every weapon in the arsenal of democracy. After 9 years in the Marine Corps, I didn't intend to take any orders from any son of a bitch that walks. I think we can encapsulate that neatly in the work of Martha Biondi, who's fortunately here, and I'll tell it the way that I tell it to my students in somewhat of a joke. But if you come from Mississippi and you move to New York, you can't go back to Mississippi and you can't go to Canada, so you have one option: to stand and to fight. And what we're talking about are people who made a conscious decision to stand and to fight. And we can't miss the contemporary connections of this. From Mumia Abu-Jamal to the James Byrd, we can't miss talking about those contemporary connections as well. Where I want to end with you today, I gotta skip a lot of good stuff. You see all the great stuff you're missing. Don't front. Where I want to end is talking about two things very quickly: housing and healthcare, and how they represent the state of the field in terms of Black Power studies. In terms of freedom rights, I want to deal with this poem again that was the inspiration for Gary Bartz's poem, right, his song. It was also the inspiration for Lorraine Hansberry, and I want to share with you a passage from Lorraine Hansberry's Raisin in the Sun, where it's Walter Lee Younger's monologue, and he's talking about what he hopes to get out of life. You know, you wouldn't understand it yet, son, but your daddy's going to make a transaction, a business transaction that's going to change our lives. That's how come one day when you're about 17 years old, I'll come And I'll pull the car up on the driveway, just a plain black Chrysler, I think, with white walls. No, black tires. And the gardener will be clipping away at the hedges and will say, "Good evening, Mr. Younger." And I'll say, "Hello, Jefferson. How are you this evening?" Jefferson. And I'll go inside, and Ruth will come downstairs and meet me at the door, and we'll kiss each other, and she'll take my arm, and we'll go up to your room, and we'll see you sitting on the floor with the catalogs of all the great schools in America around you. All the great schools in the world. And I'll say, "All right, son, it's your 17th birthday. What is it you've decided? Just tell me what it is you want to be, son, and you'll be it. Whatever you want to be, yes, sir, you just name it, son, and I'll hand you the world." Well, a reporter asked Lorraine Hansberry after this, not too soon, "Well, this is not really a Negro play. Why, this could be a play about anybody. It's a play about people. What's your reaction? What do you say?" To which Lorraine Hansberry responded, "Well, I hadn't noticed the contradiction because I'd always been under the impression that Negroes are people." When we talk about freedom rights and freedom politics, we're talking about organizing around human rights and those things that made African Americans feel like citizens. We're talking about civil rights. But what ultimately made them feel like citizens of the world when we're talking about human rights, something that Judy Richardson knows very well, something that Cleve Sellers knows very well. And of course, in Donna and Hasan's book, you get elements of that. I want to share one more thing with you. I promise, Rob, I got one and I'm done. It's Gil Scott-Heron. You can't stand in front of Gil without reading Gil. We have spent all this time talking about healthcare in this country and Obama's healthcare bill, and thank goodness for that, healthcare reform. But remember, Black power was central to that discussion as well. So I share with you a poem from Gil Scott-Heron from 1972, "Whitey on the Moon." "A rat done bit my sister Nell with Whitey on the moon. Her face and arms began to swell, and Whitey's on the moon. I can't pay no doctor bills, but Whitey's on the moon. 10 years from now, I'll be paying still while Whitey's on the moon. The man just upped my rent last night because Whitey's on the moon. No hot water, no toilets, no lights, and Whitey's on the moon. I wonder why he's upping me because Whitey's on the moon. I was already giving him $50 a week, but now Whitey's on the moon. Taxes take my whole damn check. The junkies make me a nervous wreck. The price of food is going up, and if all that stuff wasn't enough. A rat done bit my sister Nell with Whitey on the moon. Her face and arms began to swell, but Whitey's on the moon. Was all that money I made last year for Whitey on the moon? How come there ain't no money here? Whitey's on the moon. Y'all know I think about just having my fill of Whitey on the moon. I think I'll send these bills, doctor bills, airmail special, to Whitey on the moon." Now, if you substitute the moon for Iraq and Afghanistan, and you substitute Whitey for the Bush, I'm kidding. If you do that, you can see, in all seriousness, that Black power was addressing issues of medical care in the 1960s and 1970s. I say that because if we look at the scholarship today, and we talk about new directions, a new book from 2005, "Am Your Sister" on Audre Lorde, who we know as a lesbian feminist poet, but also an advocate of Black power, who battled breast cancer and made healthcare a central feature of her political discourse. We can look at the work of Alondra Nelson, a recent book that came out 2 years ago, "Body and Soul, the Black Panther Party in the Fight Against Medical Discrimination." I would submit to you that Black power studies is influenced by what Martha Biondi and Ibram Rogers talked about yesterday, what Manning Marable described as the imperative of Black studies to be three things: descriptive, prescriptive, and corrective. So I end with you on this note. We talk about the campus to the street. I gotta skip all this because you guys don't know what you meant. I end with you on this note. If we look at this contemporary moment, as we're talking about the 99% and all these other issues, so what we're looking at is the blueprint for Black power. Now that, as Hasan said, people are worried about police brutality, but it's not just Black folks. People are worried about housing, but it's not just Black folks. People are worried about education, but it's not just Black folks. This scholarship has tremendous resonance for where we are today in this historical moment. And so I want to thank you for your time, and I'm done.
What we're going to do, because we are short on time, and I do want to make sure that our final group of panels also get their opportunity to speak. is we're going to take some questions now. Judy has stepped out, and she's back in. And so I'm going to turn the floor over to Judy for 5 minutes. Then we're going to have to do a very short, and I apologize, session of question and answers within 5 minutes, which means more questions and less comments.
Okay, I'm going to do this fairly quickly. It may be a little bit over 5 minutes, but it will not be much over 5 minutes. First of all, I want to say that coming as a SNCC person who has been doing teacher training since I was on the prize, and we do, lots of classes and all of that, what you constantly get confronted with is people who are still understanding the civil rights movement as very separate from Black power, as assuming that the civil rights movement was all philosophically nonviolent, which, hello, was mainly the Nashville Project. And so, and by the way, I love the way you say NAG was TNAG, but it was actually the Nonviolent Action Group, which is what Stokely comes out of, which is what Cynthia Washington comes out of, which is what a number of Black activists come out of when they go into Mississippi. But, so what's great is to see this group of young scholars. And, for me, of course, anybody under 40 is young, but still, these are young scholars. And when I first got to know about them, I think I had come to the OAH meeting, Organization of American Historians, and that was, during the first series of Eyes on the Prize. And none of you guys were there because you might not have been born yet, hello. And so and even when we were doing the first series of Eyes on the Prize, we didn't have any of these guys. And then we get Charles Payne, and then we get John Dittmer and local movement scholarship. But then we get Hasan and Donna and Yohuru, and we get Emily Crosby, who first introduces me to a number of these folks through her local movement scholarship, local movement scholars conference. So let me just comment on a couple of things, and I'm going to go over a couple. I won't go point by point because some of them are repeated in one way or another, and so I'm just going to talk about some thematic stuff. The continuing connection between the South and the North. When Ruth Howard, now Ruth Howard Chambers, goes into Mississippi and Alabama, coming out of Howard's campus, when she comes into SNCC, Miss Baker, who is, her philosophy is what grounds us with grass movement's philosophy. When Miss Baker meets Ruth Howard, she says something about where are you from, and Ruth says that she's from Rocky Mount. That's where her folks are from. And the thing is, what Miss Baker says is, who are your people? Now, Ruth knows Miss Baker because she's coming from the South. Now, she may live in Washington, D.C., but her roots are in the South. Charlie Cobb, when he goes into Greenville, Mississippi, his people are from Greenville, Mississippi. You get that all the way along. Second thing was in terms of the economics, which a lot of the folks are talking about. Let's remember that SNCC speech that John Lewis delivers, but is the SNCC speech in 1963 at the March on Washington, starts off by saying, thank you for all coming, but we are sorry that our brothers, and hopefully he would now add sisters, our brothers and sisters, we are sorry that they cannot be here because they don't have the money for the transportation to get here to Washington, D.C. And then about the third graph down, in the SNCC speech at the March on Washington, it says, referring to the proposed 1964 Civil Rights Bill, it says, what is there in this bill that will protect a woman making $2 a day in the home of a family making $70,000 a year? Now, SNCC is talking about economics in the early 1960s. It's not until 1968 that you hear Dr. King talk about what we need is a radical redistribution of economic power, okay? So, throughout the country. But when she comes out of Batesville, Mississippi, she joins us, but then she goes to the Columbia J School, the journalism school, and then goes to work at the Oakland Tribune. And what she says is, I don't even want to answer my phone because all of my relatives are here in Oakland, and they all want me to come to Sunday dinner. Because she said half of Batesville must be here in Oakland. Now, the whole issue of SNCC and tactical nonviolence as opposed to philosophical nonviolence, they have done it beautifully, so I won't go through that. But when I do teacher training, this was last year, and it was this year. And some teachers who teach, where's Yale? Yale is in New Haven, Connecticut. And one of the teachers came up to me and said, you know, I've been thinking about what you said at our last teacher training about the whole role of tactical nonviolence as opposed to philosophical nonviolence. And he said, you know, that's been very hard for me to get through. I mean, it is very hard. And I had had a Springfield, Massachusetts teacher tell me that, you know, she had been using that whole thing about philosophical nonviolence to talk to her students about, you know, not fighting so much. And I said, well, you do that and you're going to turn them off. They need to know how self-defense was used. And I would mention that Charlie Cobb, who is now a visiting professor at Brown, but who, you know, was one of the early organizers of SNCC, and one of the founders of National Association of Black Journalists, and a number of other things, and has done 2 really wonderful books on the movement, including Radical Equations with Bob Moses. One of the things, the book he is now working on is self-defense in the Southern movement, going way back before World War II and the returning black vets. So there's a whole thing going on here. Also, in terms of just the continuum, what's interesting is and then I have one more thing and then I'll stop. The whole issue of leadership. And one of the things I mentioned in this morning session was that we started saying, you know, black faces in high places don't necessarily get you freedom. Now, it's one of the things you see here in this country, which they have referred to, but of course you also see it in South Africa. And so there's this sense that it takes more and it takes continuing pressure, and it's one of the things that I think we, the movement from the 60s, didn't adequately do. And part of it was also we didn't know how hard it was going to be to do, but that's a whole other thing. The whole issue of the movement and the consciousness that we had, it's not just that we had bookstores and publishing houses, but we had black research institutes. And I remember there were 3 or 4 of them that were around the country, and they were specifically targeted to getting statistics out. So it wasn't just that you had the Brookings Institute or the Urban Institute. You had black research centers because we understood the importance of having the research to back up anything you were going to say. It's the reason when I do keynotes on